Right, good morning, everyone. This is an open meeting of the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee being conducted remotely pursuant to Chapter 20 of the Acts of 2021. For this meeting, the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee is convening by video conference via the Zoom app as posted on the town's website, identifying how the public may join. Ensuring public access does not ensure public participation unless such participation is required by law. This meeting will feature public comment. Members of the public wishing to participate in the meeting must use their full name for Zoom access. If full names are not used, people will not be allowed to participate in the discussion. The town reserves the right to remove any member of the public from the meeting who doesn't use a full name or who acts inappropriately. I'm Mary Longacre, Chair of the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee. Permit me to confirm that all members and persons anticipated on the agenda are present and can hear me. Members, when I call your name, please respond in the affirmative. We have Gary Bellard.
Here.
Is Sarah Boyce.
Here.
I do not see Peter Brace. We know that Matt Fee is not joining us at the start. Do we have Ian Golding? Did not see Ian. Jen Carberg.
Here.
Fritz McClure.
Here.
And Joanna Roach.
Here.
All right, thank you. And staff, when I call your name, please respond in the affirmative. Vince Murphy.
Here.
And Holly Backus. Present. Thank you, Holly. And then anticipated speakers on the agenda, please respond in the affirmative. We have Trevor Johnson, a Senior Resilience Planner from Arcadis.
Here.
Devin McGee, Resilience Planner with Arcadis.
Here.
Chelsea Kilburn, Stoss Landscape Designer.
Here.
And we also have Will Kinsella from Acclimate.
Here.
Thank you all. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and that all attendees are participating by video conference. Accordingly, please be aware that other folks may be able to see you, and take care not to share your screen. Anything you broadcast may be captured by the recording. And also a reminder to silence cell phones, please. All supporting materials that have been provided members of this body are available on the town's website unless otherwise noted. The public is encouraged to follow along using the posted agenda unless the chair notes otherwise. And just a side note, I will be offering a change to the agenda, so we will start with that once the announcement is finished. We are now turning to the first item on the agenda. Before we do so, permit me to cover some ground rules for effective and clear conduct of our business and to ensure accurate meeting minutes. The chair will introduce each speaker on the agenda. After they conclude their remarks, the chair will go down the line of members, inviting each by name to provide any comments, questions, or motions. Please hold until your name is called. Further, please remember to mute your phone or computer when you're not speaking, and please remember to speak clearly and in a way that helps generate accurate minutes. For any response, please wait until the chair yields the floor to you and state your name before speaking. If members wish to engage in conversation with other members, please do so through the chair, taking care to identify yourself. And for items with public comment, after members have spoken, the chair will afford public comment to those members of the public who have joined the meeting via Zoom. Members of the public who wish to speak must state their names and be acknowledged by and speak through the chair. Finally, each vote taken in this meeting will be conducted by a roll call vote. So as regarding the agenda, we have been asked to provide additional time to Arcadis, and I'm happy to accommodate that. So I am asking for your unanimous consent to begin with item 7, the request to the select board, so that we can move that forward. That has a time-sensitive component to it. And then we will go back to items 3, 4, and 5. Other items on the agenda we will get to if we have time, although I note that we do need to speak about upcoming meeting dates and topics. So we may not be able to get to the other items on the agenda that I have not called out. So given that, we were provided with a draft of a proclamation from Acclimate for September 2021 to be declared Coastal Resilience Coastal Resilience Awareness Month. And I hope that members have a chance to look at that. Vince did have a suggestion for an edit, and we will take suggestions from other members for edits as well, so that we can vote to approve this and send it to the select board for their remaining August meeting for consideration. Vince, would you go ahead?
Thank you very much, Mary. I had a few minor things. The original said September. I've changed it to August. in the hope that it's dealt with at the August 18th select board meeting. Otherwise, we will have to wait until September 8th, I think it is, to the select board meeting then. But that's an easy change. I had to change this to Jason Bridges, and I had one edit that I would like to make to the first bullet point. Just looking for what I said exactly. Just one moment. Oops. Yes, here it is. Sorry, I would like to change the first bullet point to whereas the town of Nantucket recognizes that climate change and rising sea levels pose a, and then I would like to add, significant and increasing threat to Nantucket as outlined in various state and federal scenarios. I can put that in if people wish to see it.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and type that in, Vince? Comments or questions on that change? Sarah? Yeah.
Yeah, actually, this is taking a step back. I never received a copy of this, so I'm fully in support of the proclamation. I just would like to see it, to actually read through it, because I haven't seen it yet.
Vince, I may have misspoken. Did we send it out?
No, we
didn't. I apologize. We did not send it out.
Sorry, this was only something that kind of came about in the recent days after.
It was drafted yesterday and sent to us. So
yeah, it's just hard to make edits if we haven't seen it yet, so I can't.
I completely agree, Sarah. Thank you for pointing that out, and I apologize. We just didn't take that extra step last night, although that wouldn't have provided much time for you to review it anyway. So what is the pleasure of the committee as far as going forward? The select board has one meeting in August, and then as Vince said, the next one is September 8th. That is not necessarily an issue for approval. Jen, you have a comment?
Yes, or a question, I guess, Mary. Is this proclamation much different from the one that we made and approved last year? Is it the same in text?
It was updated from 2020 to 2021, so some tenses were changed and dates were changed, but it's essentially the same. And Will, if you want to speak to that, if you have anything to add.
Hi, thank you, Mary. Just for the record, my name is William Kinsella, the chair of Acclimate. The proclamation is largely the same as the proclamation that was passed by this passed by CRAC as well as the select board last year. As Vince had noted, the chair of the select board has changed. Some of the dates have changed, but the wording of the proclamation itself remain largely unchanged.
Thank you, Will.
Thank you.
So do members want to proceed with the document today, or do we want to postpone that to a future meeting? I'll take a motion to either effect.
I'll make a motion to move forward with approving today.
Thank you, Sarah. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Fritz. Any discussion of that before we vote? Jen?
Just for clarity, Mary, is this discussion of voting it or voting to discuss it?
Voting to discuss it because it was not provided in advance. I wanted to just make it clear that we
Perfect, thank you.
Leaving any out. So roll call vote on proceeding with the discussion. Gary Beller.
Aye.
Sarah Boyce.
Aye.
Jen Carberg.
Aye.
Chris McClure.
Aye.
Joanna Roach.
Aye.
And Mary Longacre. Aye. Thank you. And my apologies again for causing us to take that extra time today. So we have Vince's edit. Any comments on what he has typed on the screen on that first bullet? Jen.
Thank you, Mary. I would just say, since we approved this in context last year, I'm happy with approving it as is. The only thing, Vince, I would say to your changes you just said, I prefer taking out the word shores because I think it's to Nantucket and the island itself, so not just the shoreline, but otherwise, I liked the rest of it just fine and have no other comments.
Through you, Mary, I
Yes.
agree because I made the same comment and then when I copied and pasted it in, I brought back a word I didn't mean to, sorry.
Vince, I think you had another edit further down the document with the URL.
So yes, it's just a minor thing. This is a tiny URL. So it just kind of looks out of place. If we replaced it with a proper YouTube link, people could see that it's not spurious or unusual in any way. It's only minor. This still takes you there, but providing a proper URL that people would recognize and be able to check, the HTTPS for secure is always important, and the full name and address of where you're going.
And just for clarity, I think I'm the one that created the tiny URL last year in order to make it easier to type if someone had to type it, but we've gotten so accustomed to being electronic now, I don't think that's an issue. So I'm perfectly in support of that change. And then I wanted to open the discussion about the third bullet point, where it says Town of Nantucket is finishing the planning process for coastal resilience. And I was hoping for language that would make it more clear that the process is ongoing. We are, definitely coming to the conclusion of the coastal resilience plan, but even that will be an iterative exercise. So if we have suggestions for how to change that language, and perhaps even Trevor might have something to say there that's more appropriate than to say that we're finishing the planning process. We could say, we could say the town of Nantucket is expecting delivery of the coastal resilience plan. That would be more appropriate, I think.
May I chime in?
Please go ahead, Trevor.
I would say that the town of Nantucket is, completing its first coastal resilience plan, sort of a pivotal or foundational step in the town's coastal resilience planning process. Acknowledging that this is a key moment and an important step forward, but that the planning process will continue, in the years and decades ahead. Or something to that effect.
I was going to say, Vincent, do you think you can type that, or Trevor, can you say that again?
The town of Nantucket is, nearing completion of its first coastal resilience plan.
And I think we can leave it there because this is, just key to the month of September. I didn't like the word finishing.
Yeah.
I didn't want to imply that it was one and done.
And then take out.
All right, I'll read the rest of the bullet points while Vince is working on that. So bullet point number 2, whereas the select board formed the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee in part to assist with obtaining community feedback on climate change and sea level rise. I think that is verbatim from last year. The 4th, whereas the town of Nantucket through a municipal vulnerability preparedness grant developed a Resilient Nantucket toolkit for adapting historic resources for sea level rise. That bullet was updated because last year we're in the process and that is now complete. And then we have the 2 statements about acclimate, and I believe those were only changed to reflect 2021 as opposed to 2020. The rest, I don't know if there are any significant changes. If there are other comments, let us know. But if not, I would be happy to take a motion to approve this document and send it to the select board for their consideration.
So moved.
Fritz, do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Gary. Any further discussion before we vote? No, okay. Roll call vote, Gary Beller,
Aye.
Sarah Boyce,
Aye.
Jen Carberg,
Aye.
Fritz McClure,
Aye.
Joanna Roche,
Aye.
and Mary Longacre, aye. Thank you very much. So we will turn to the next item on the agenda, which is a follow-up on the July 27th presentation from Arcadia. I have a brief comment for this. First, Joanna had made a statement about 4 to 9 inches of sea level rise being the reference point that the Envision Resilience Challenge was using. And I questioned that statement and said I needed to check. Joanna was completely right. I was taken by surprise. And I have an anecdote that want to relate to make the point. I happened to run into Cecil Jensen on the street, and I mentioned Joanna's comment to her, and she was also surprised at 4 to 9 inches of sea level rise, saying that's a lot. And I think that it really points out that even two people who you would think would be intimately aware of the predictions for sea level rise were taken aback at numbers for a 2030 projection. That it's just hard for us to wrap our minds around what that sea level rise will mean. And I think that we need to help the public by making that a little bit more explicit. And so from our conversation at the last meeting, we did mention a desire to have 2030 be more in the public's eye in the report. And I would add to that, adding sea level rise information, because Joanna again had a question about, is it the time frame that we're concerned about? Is it the impact that we're concerned about? And I think that we want to be more explicit about the impact. The time frame is a proxy for the impact, and it's useful for planning purposes, but I don't think that we should focus entirely on the years that we're looking at without being more, ideas keep you more specific about what the impact is that we're planning for. So my suggestions are that we add a tier for 2030 risk, that we add information about sea level rise to those tiers. And then there's a further comment that we'll get to in a minute, but I wanted to open up to the committee the discussion of those two points. And also to the representatives from Arcadis and Stoss for their comments. Trevor, did you have, we'll go to Sarah and then go ahead.
Yeah, I fully support adding the 2030 because I think it helps people see, the more immediacy of it. But I guess I'm confused. The second point is that adding the amount, because I thought that was already part of, I guess I'm confused about your second point. If it's like just adding the amount or adding something different that we haven't talked about yet. Like the amount of prediction. So
it would be to essentially look at the scenarios that we're using and say, for instance, at 2050, the reason that properties are at extreme risk from flooding is because sea level rise is projected to be between X and Y inches. And at 2070, it's projected to be within X and Y inches, and at 2100 and so on, and at 2030, if we add that tier. So it's just bringing that information to the front of people's attention instead of saying, well, in 2050, there's risk and the risk is on the table, and then go look at the table and there's 150 boxes and which one are we talking about? Just bringing that to the forefront. Jen?
Yes, thank you, Mary. I think it's important in the context of the entire plan to have this information, and I'm assuming it will be in there as far as what those projections are for sea level rise and change over time. And those numbers didn't surprise me because we've been talking about them and looking at them for a long time as far as the 9 feet by 2100. That is the projection scenario. It's not in 2030, it's in 2100. I think that I am okay with letting Arcadia figure out what the best way to present this information is. I don't think, this is just one piece of the puzzle that we're looking at, and it has in there that mean monthly high water is what triggers the extreme risk. I'm assuming the plan will then go on to talk about what those monthly mean high water pieces are. So I guess I'm standing at the point where I don't want to micromanage how they do explain what the tiers are and put together graphs. But I think making the point that we want to make sure those numbers are in there and laid out, because that is an important thing that would surprise a lot of people.
Thank you, Jen. Further comments? And I see Peter has joined us. Welcome, Peter. Is there a response from Arcadis?
Just a concurrence. I think, absolutely. I think the scenarios kind of that define the risk tiers are in the slides from the previous meeting, but Certainly within the plan, we'll provide, details as to exactly what the sea level rise increments that we're planning around and what, when those increments are expected to occur given current projections. So yeah, full agreement. We can certainly add in the specific increments to the plan and any further dissemination of those slides.
Okay, any further comments? All right, so I just want to repeat something that I said to Joanna, and that is that I'm really glad that you have a fresh look at this. Most of us have been steeped in this for quite some time, and a new set of eyes is very helpful. So I'm glad that you've joined us on the committee. Thank you. There was also we did receive public comment, or I should say Vince received feedback on the label for safe growth. There was also some public reaction to that, which I don't know was shared. But Vince, if you want to share the feedback that you got from Doug Rose, Doug is also on the call if he would want to share it directly about the term safe growth. And we can consider whether or not that term is appropriate in this context.
Sure. So 1 second, I'm just trying to search of my email has been slow. I had a comment from Doug Rose that I got via email. Then there was a handful of points. One of the more salient ones was about one term on a large island map that indicated safe growth. The term for coastal resilience was only meant in a coastal resilience context, not in a general context, that in terms of coastal resilience, some mid-island locations were pointed at as where could be considered safe growth, meaning where in the, and then by contrast, where in the coastal zones represented not safe growth. So some people took that to mean that what might already be considered by some people overly developed communities might continue to be overly developed in a further fashion. I made the point to Doug that it was only in, by email, it was only in coastal resilience terms is what we meant, that inland away from coastal areas is what was meant by that. I'm sorry, this is not finding what I want quickly. Here it is. And then after the fact, each time I found out that the initial email that was sent to me as questions, and then later after I sent a response, both ended up being posted on Facebook, which is fine. They're public. It's to me. I work for the town. Anything I do in an email can be made public. I'm not worried about that. So, Ms. Doug, would you like to comment on that, or would you like me to share the email chain, or does it matter to you? Just whatever you prefer.
Yeah, no, that's great. And Vince, thanks for responding to my original email. I think the overall point I was trying to make is that so much of the nuance of communicating the measures that are being recommended here are lost with an audience that won't devote the time to watching the ongoing discussions like this at a crack meeting. They're not going to tune in and watch a 2-hour video and really understand what the intent was of certain language. So it's all the more important that the language be super clear and super crisp. The average constituent member of the public is going to see words and they're going to react to them in a very visceral way. So just a cautionary note, and safe growth was, I think, one of probably a few examples where there could be opportunities to make the communication just that much sharper and that much clearer, so that it doesn't require a lot of this kind of back and forth. I hope that makes sense. And thanks again, Vince. I appreciate your response. I took it absolutely at face value, and I figured you wouldn't mind if I shared it with the audience that was debating the real meaning. What did they mean by safe growth, right? Because I think the answer was very clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Vince?
Yeah, not worried. Share whatever. Doesn't really bother me. If I write it, it's done on the town's time. Therefore, it's effectively public and can be shared. I'm not worried. I think we just have to be a little bit cautious. I agree. Crisp language does make things lovely and nice, but this is drafts along the way towards a final report, and so that kind of feedback is very useful but these presentations are for the committee and for the public, and taking them as a finished article straight away when that may not be the case is something we're trying to flesh out in these meetings. That is a large part of the purpose that I'm hoping for, and that I know that the consulting team, the project team, are trying to get this type of feedback so they can fix these issues. So nothing negative taken either.
Thank you, Vince. So as I thought about the question, I came up with the term minimal risk as being perhaps better language to describe what was intended for that area. And I didn't know if other people had thoughts about other ways that that label could be clearer. And certainly also the Arcadis team can weigh in on that as well. Sarah?
Thank you, Mary. I really agree with the minimal risk or something to that effect, because it takes out the perceived intended action of the safe growth phrase. We know that just from other committees, votes in the town meeting and things, that there is such a it's a hot button issue of talking about development and concentrating development. So I think I really like that minimal risk, because then it takes it off of this committee. We're not suggesting where development should go. We're not making that leap yet, but we're saying that from a coastal resiliency perspective, sea level rise, erosion, that these are the areas that are minimally at risk to the things that this committee is looking at. So I think, Mary, I appreciate that. And then just one more thing, I think we had said in a previous meeting when we were talking about with Trevor and those maps, always put draft on every slide. And this is why, because people take those little screenshots and pass them around Facebook, and it gets taken out of context. So I really appreciate that. I think the map did say in big red, it was draft. So I think that's really helpful, because I did see some of those comments as well, Vince, and some people thought that this was the end of the plan, this was the final map that everyone's going to see. So I think I appreciate that too, kind of reinforcing that we're in process and there's still room for comment.
So Joanna, I think you had your hand up. I'm going to go to Holly first. She had a comment in the chat. I want to make sure we capture, and then we'll go to you. Holly, are you available?
Thank you, Mary.
Okay. Thank you.
I just want to notate that I agree with your statement to change the safe growth label so it's not misconstrued from a planning perspective. Thanks.
Thank you, Holly. And then Trevor also had a follow-up. I apologize, Joanna. Trevor, do you want to share that with us as well from the chat?
Oh, I was just going to clarify that I think I'm in agreement with everything that's being discussed here. The intention is never to suggest growth, but really to find areas where there could be where there is minimal coastal risk, or any future conversations that the community has around policy or planning for not just growth in terms of development, but capital planning, infrastructure improvement, things of that nature. That we know where those low risk areas are. So minimal risk is fine. I would suggest minimal coastal risk, just to clarify that we haven't analyzed risk from other types of hazards. So we can't speak to whether those risks exist in areas that we would define as being minimally at risk of coastal hazards.
Thank you, Trevor. And Joanna, you had something to add too.
So I agree with what you're saying in the languaging. And I also think I have a suggestion just about the report and about how we're discussing it today. It seems that what would be helpful for the public would be an overlay of the report that has maybe 10 talking points. Because I think that, to what Doug was saying, and I think that in terms of how much time people are willing to invest in watching our meetings or reading these reports, they pull out what they see as important. And I think it would be important for us to pull out what's important for them to learn, right? Sorry, excuse me. So to the point of what you were saying about the 4 to 9 inch sea level rise by 2030, you know, that's 9 years. When I say that to people, they're surprised, right? Having the same reaction. But then when I say things like, you know, there's 195 buildings in the Main Street town area that would be affected, the roads on Washington Street or Easy Street, these are things that can be affected, right? Then the context of what's happening starts to make sense. So if there were a sheet that had, say, 10 talking points that were provided to this group of people and could be shared as information dissemination, I think it would be helpful for people in the context of what we're discussing.
Thank you, Joanna. And Jen?
Joanna, I think that's a great idea. And I think, at least from my perspective of what we as the CRAC committee, we're going to do is that when we have this final plan, that's something that we're going to work with and put together. And I do just want to clarify real quick that 4 to 9 feet sea level rise is not by 2030, it's by
4 to 9 inches. Inches, Jen.
Okay, inches.
Right. You're right.
Feet.
No, 9
It's
feet is
4
fine.
to, it's 9 feet by
We'd be swimming.
100. So that's the we have to be pretty clear on those numbers.
So we do need to move on. Vince, a final comment on this topic before we turn to Trevor's presentation.
Nothing, it's just to take back to one thing that Sarah said and to agree, and just to point out and kind of enlarge one of the things Sarah said. Yeah, people did email me and contact me saying, hey, I hear there's a draft of the report out, can I have it now? And I had to say to people, well, there's not. I sent them the link to the presentation, and that seemed to satisfy people when I was asked for it. I've also been asked for a draft of the report since June a few times, once people see stuff that comes from the Envision Resilience project from the design challenge from Remain. Every time something goes up, people ask me for a draft of the report because they think something final is out. And every time I have to say, not there yet, I'm sorry.
I hope you also invite them to participate in the discussion.
Here, yes, at CRAC meetings always.
So let me make one quick point, and that is that we are not really set up to take comments through the chat. We do prefer them to be verbal for the recording. So please, raise your hand and let us know that you have a comment. If we're not getting to you, then send a message through the chat requesting to make a comment, but let's not have comments going back and forth in the chat. Thank you. So we will turn it over to Trevor Johnson and the team from Arcadis and Stoss, and that is for an update on draft resilience strategies that could be included in the coastal resilience plan. Please go ahead, Trevor.
All right, thank you, Mary. I'm going to share my screen here. I think I'm sharing the right screen. So for those who are watching, live or future recordings, I think it's very important, following up on the conversation we just had, to make clear that these are preliminary draft recommendations for discussion today and in the future. This is not the final plan. These are not the final recommendations. These build off of the community engagement that's happened over the course of this project, as well as the open house that was hosted in late June. To propose preliminary strategies that we're looking forward to discussing. And I think we have a lot to cover. So with that, I will jump in. So today we've already discussed follow up to the resilience framework that was presented during the last CRAC meeting. Today we're going to talk about draft resilience strategies for 3 areas of Nantucket: downtown, Mattocket, and Nantucket Harbor and Co2. I've put some timeframes there. We will be able to stay until the end. I want to leave 5 minutes for CRAC committee to finish up its business, but we want to certainly give this enough time for discussion today. So again, we're going to discuss downtown, Mattocket, Nantucket Harbor, and Co2. We will be back in 2 weeks, and just to give kind of a forecast about what we will be discussing in more detail at that time, we will have an opportunity for follow-up from today's discussion. So I'll provide an email at the end of this presentation where we can collect comments in the interim, and then we will be happy to take additional comments once folks have had a chance to review these slides. on their own time, that, both CRAC members and members of the public. In 2 weeks, we'll also talk about island-wide erosion management strategies. So thinking about strategies that apply in a variety of areas across Nantucket's coastline, including Ensconset, Tom Nevers, and the airport and Surfside wastewater treatment plant. We will talk about draft property owner guidance for building and property scale resilience. You'll see that mentioned in some of our strategies today. We'll have more details on that in 2 weeks. We'll talk about some of our draft kind of guidance on regulatory and bylaw changes that may be necessary to build resilience and enable some of the strategies that we'll be discussing. And then finally, draft recommendations for town governance and process improvement. So kind of closing the loop on a lot of the strategies that will be recommended through the Coastal Resilience Plan. And this is all leading towards development of our draft report, the draft CRP, in the next month or so. So I start with this slide, which is a rendering that shows this isn't an actual street in Nantucket, although these are actual buildings on Nantucket. This is kind of a photo montage that displays what a flood scenario, a coastal flood in 2070 might look like, and the impacts that it would have on the community. And it's clear from this, as I'm sure you can tell, that inaction is not an option, and that we need to, as we've been doing for the past year or so, plan for reducing risk, managing risk, and building resilience across the island. And as I'm sure many of you saw, the trustees of reservations released their State of the Coast report this week. Wonderful document with a lot of good ideas in there, excellent focus on Nantucket. A lot of things were familiar to us, which is great. We see a lot of consistency between the kinds of strategies and risk analyses that we've been undertaking and what the trustees has been able to put together. I did pull out this quote, which I think is a great call to action that echoes a lot of what we think is necessary, which is that the trustees says our projections indicate islanders must make hard choices now about how to avoid and reduce flood risk. And I would extend that to coastal erosion risk as well. It's not just a matter of looking at local infrastructure site by site to buy time and increase the odds of success. Discussions and initiatives should focus on the best opportunities to collaborate and improve resiliency. And I think that theme of collaboration is something we've heard throughout our process and want to see continue. And virtually all of the strategies that we'll talk about in this presentation are going to require a significant amount of collaboration. So just the final introductory slide. What we're going to walk through today are phased adaptation strategies for each area, downtown, Matagit, and Nantucket Harbor and Coatue, beginning with key strategic opportunities. So the near-term strategic opportunities, these are opportunities that draw on our open house feedback as well as other community engagement and technical analysis to recommend projects that should move to implementation today. These are projects that will reduce risk and are kind of the first step forward towards building longer term resilience. So for those, we'll talk about some of the key considerations for near-term implementation. These near-term steps are, as I mentioned, kind of first steps, and they build towards longer-term adaptation scenarios. And these longer-term adaptation scenarios are not something that we necessarily need to have built by 2030, but will need to be built, given long-term sea level rise projections, and that future versions of the CRP and future planning processes can contemplate as we move forward in time. And so it's important that we kind of, to use the metaphor, walk and chew gum at the same time in terms of planning for near-term action, while also thinking about the long-term and how those near-term steps plug into that long-term scenario or strategy. And then finally, implementation, that's going to be a key part of what's driven kind of our near-term projects. You'll see a lot of work that builds on recommendations from the hazard mitigation plan. We don't see this as a redundant step. We see this as building, off of existing momentum and moving the ball forward towards implementation of projects that are fundable, can be permitted, and are actually, achievable for the town to administer and implement. So with that introduction, I'm going to jump into downtown. We'll walk through the entire presentation for each area and then pause for conversation. I imagine there'll be requests from committee members to return to certain slides and get a closer look. So happy to do that when we enter the discussion. So I'll walk through downtown now and then for 15 to 20 minutes and then pause for conversation. So defending downtown, this was the theme statement that was presented at the open house in June. This is, if you remember, the kind of spectrum from retreat, relocate, to adapt, to defend or protect. This is the, downtown is the sort of one area of Nantucket where we have a concentration of buildings, resources, services, critical infrastructure that really warrant more of a protective strategy. Of course, we want to do that in a way that's consistent with the character and identity of downtown Nantucket and what makes it special. But we also believe that this is an area where the risk is such that we want to take a hard look at strategies that can help reduce that risk in a meaningful way. And that's what this strategy attempts to do. And so this is a refinement of the maps that were shown during the open house in June. This is the near-term strategy, something that looks at the next 10 years in terms of implementation. And there's a number of different projects and approaches that are kind of captured here, and I'll walk through them quickly from top to bottom. The first is wetland resilience and the potential for sediment enhancement in the creeks. Coastal wetlands obviously are vital in terms of buffering from storms, as well as ecological services that they provide. We want to ensure that these resources are able to keep pace with sea level rise. A lot of technical analysis, has been ongoing and will continue to need to happen in terms of understanding how these ecosystems react to sea level rise. But we want to be thinking about strategies that do promote wetland resilience over time. The other piece of this is that adapted buildings and infrastructure for coastal flooding, major storm events will be necessary in downtown. The strategy, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, the strategy that we're recommending is designed to protect to high frequency flood events that have a chance of happening 20 to 30 times per year by the 2070s, would represent a significant disruption to everyday life in downtown. But the strategy does not protect against low probability, sort of high consequence flood events. So we need to be thinking about the building scale strategies that we'll need to protect those buildings. Of course, we talked about the critical infrastructure at Strait Wharf and Steamboat Wharf in terms of access to the island. It is necessary to elevate these, elevate or otherwise retrofit these structures to address the threat of sea level rise. And again, we're not talking about necessarily the significant storm events, but just overtopping on daily or monthly, weekly or monthly high tides. And then the line of defense that we'll talk a little bit more about on the next slide is intended to kind of protect the downtown core from that high frequency flooding that will happen 25 to 30 times per year under current projections for sea level rise by the 2070s. And then for Brant Point, again, adapted buildings and infrastructure are necessary to protect against coastal flooding. But we also have a concentration of residences here that are highly vulnerable, and future conditions, sea level rise conditions will impact the ability to access these properties, under under tidal and storm conditions. And so we recommend elevation of the roadway in Brant Point to ensure that we have emergency access available to these properties under flood conditions. And then the final point is just recognizing that Brant Point is a very important kind of area for sheltering the harbor, right? It does provide a buffer to the harbor. It is, in part why the harbor is where it is. And so there needs to be ongoing erosion management along Brant Point to ensure that that piece of land is able to, maintain its function there in sheltering the harbor. The next slide goes into a little bit more detail on the line of protection here. So as I mentioned, the key near-term step is district scale flood protection for the downtown core to the expected elevation of mean monthly high water in 2070. This combines a series of infrastructure investments that includes elevated roads, reinforced dunes, raised bulkheads and berms, depending on the exact extent, as a way of achieving the elevation that would be necessary. We need to start working on this today in order to implement it by the 2030s. And the important thing to mention here is that there's still alternatives that are being that we can discuss and are still being assessed along this line of protection. And also, as I'll show in a moment, there are opportunities to make sure that this line of protection can be integrated with the existing character of downtown. It's not that we are suggesting building a wall around downtown, but really thinking creatively about how this type of infrastructure could be implemented in a way that's sensitive to and responsive to the historic character of downtown. And more than that, even I think provides the potential for new amenities as part of the line of protection. So you may be asking, I mentioned it before, but why not, if we're going to invest in significant infrastructure, why not invest in something that protects the downtown to a future, provides the maximum amount of protection that we would currently plan for today. That would be, sort of the 2070 1% flood. And this diagram shows in section kind of the distinction in elevation between an elevation that would protect against mean monthly high water in the 2070s versus something that would protect against a lower probability storm in the 2070s. And you can see there's quite a difference. The red sort of vertical line shows the elevation to 2070s mean monthly high water. Then the dashed line shows the difference between that and that 1% annual chance flood. And I think the key thing here is sort of referencing the height of a person or the height of a car. It is much more, it is possible, I would say, to integrate an elevation that is 1 to 2 feet above existing grade in a way that is seamless and does not significantly disrupt the way that people experience downtown Nantucket. An investment in a flood wall or other infrastructure to protect against that lower probability event today would be significantly disruptive. It's going to be twice the height of a person, really significantly altering what downtown Nantucket is. That's not to say that we couldn't do that in the future, of course, right? So we're not saying that we would preclude building to that elevation in the future. That is an option. Future adaptability is a part of any resilient solution. So as we're developing solutions for today that might be designed to protect against longer term frequent flooding, we can think about in the future, do we want to raise that elevation? Does our risk tolerance lower? Do we have new information that helps us decide about what the right solution might be in the future? So just keep that in mind as we're kind of looking at the next set of slides as well. So Strait Wharf is an interesting area where we are looking at a couple different alternatives for how you could incorporate a line of protection into the downtown setting. And I think it's illustrative in terms of, this is one area where you have kind of clear trade-offs between, cost, extent, feasibility, the amount of public-private participation and coordination that would need to happen, and opportunities for co-benefits and kind of incorporation of public amenities into the solution. So we're going to look at options. I'm going to walk through options 1, 2, and 3 here to kind of illustrate these trade-offs, and then very interested in having a discussion about these once we open it up. So option 1 is an alignment that is located along Easy Street. And you can see here, it's this is the same section that we looked at a moment ago in terms of the elevation difference, but a different design strategy. So this looks at the incorporation of a line of flood defense into Easy Street that could be incorporated into a planting edge or a row of seating, sort of hiding the wall in plain sight, if you will. And some of the considerations that are related to this are one, that it provides the least benefit in terms of flood protection. It's set back off of Straight Wharf, and so it's not protecting any of the buildings that are on any of the buildings or infrastructure that are located on Straight Wharf. All of that would require building scale protection and potentially relocation if we start to see very frequent tidal flooding on Straight Wharf. It is, however, the easiest to implement because it's located in a public right-of-way. So town has full control here. This is an area where, it is possible for the town to implement infrastructure on property that it owns, of course, in coordination with abutting property owners. But there's no need for easements or significant investment on private property with this alignment. And I think that's a very important distinction to keep in mind as we move through the other alternatives. As you move further back along Straight Wharf, of course, the elevation above grade for the line of protection decreases because the elevation of grade is increasing. So we just have a lower elevation above grade that needs to be achieved to provide the level of protection, and that has a lower impact on the character and experience of downtown. And then just again, all options require building scale adaptation to more severe flood events. Then as we move down Straight Wharf, we look at an option that's kind of located at the intersection of New Whale Street. And this looks at kind of the development of a gradually sloped plaza located in the vicinity of what is currently the Tavern Restaurant. And you can see here how we can integrate a flood wall into the existing built character and potentially provide new opportunities for public seating, views of the water that are a little bit more elevated. And this can be done in a way that is, accessible to, from an ADA standpoint, but also just, provides kind of nested within the existing, public realm in this part of downtown. And I think, can be integrated in a way that is not significantly disruptive to what the experience of Straight Wharf is today. So this solution or this alignment alternative provides flood protection for most of Straight Wharf. So it does have more benefits in terms of risk reduction, but it is much more challenging to implement because much of this property is privately owned. So it is a solution that would require private property owners coming together and collectively working with the town to implement this solution. As we all know, collective action is very challenging, right? And how do we make that happen? And it requires a lot of engagement. So that sort of the time to delivery for an alignment like this is going to be longer than the time to delivery for a project that's located entirely on public be This one is also going to cost more because it's longer. The linear length of the line of protection is going to be the primary driver of cost. And we have as we move through assessments and our cost estimation, we'll dial into exact figures here, but qualitatively we know that this is going to cost more. And then the final option that we'll talk about is even further down Straight Wharf, sort of at the base of the wharf or the end of the wharf. And this is a solution that looks at, again, on private property, kind of building out at the water's edge for the most part. And thinking about, and this is just kind of illustrating this option more than anything else, thinking about the, potential integration of things like rain gardens into the solution. So we can design, flood protection that doesn't just sort of provide flooding from the water side or the harbor side, but also helps with the drainage of stormwater on the interior through the implementation or design of a kind of rain garden area that also has seating and other kinds of public amenities as well. And again, this one, is probably provides the greatest benefit in terms of protection because it captures sort of the most buildings on the interior of it. But it's also, very challenging to implement just because of the number of private property owners who would need to work together and with the town to implement it. It's also located at the water's edge, which raises some additional permitting challenges. So working closely with Conservation Commission and Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, there could be additional kind of permitting challenges that would be, I don't think insurmountable in this scenario, but certainly require a little bit higher of a permitting hurdle. And then this one is also the highest cost, again, driven by just the additional length of implementation. So these are the near-term strategies. I think the Straight Wharf is shown here to help spur conversation, because it does illustrate a lot of the trade-offs that occur throughout the downtown in terms of how we look at the alignments in terms of cost, benefits, and implementation feasibility. So now I'm going to walk through. So I guess the next section of this presentation walks through, how this strategy is then built upon as part of a longer term set of scenarios. And in downtown, we have a number of different options for how this near-term strategy can be built into a long-term adaptation pathway. It's important to note that this baseline strategy is necessary in all long-term alternatives. And so it's not a question of, well, should we do the near term or should we jump right to the long term? You actually need to do the near term in any of the long-term scenarios because of the sort of the dual threats of chronic sea level rise and the more episodic or infrequent threats posed by coastal storms. So we're going to talk about a couple of different long-term alternatives. The one is adapting to a higher level of protection. And then we have two alignments that have been analyzed for that higher level of protection. The second alternative is adaptation to live with water, and we'll talk about what that means. And then finally, the third alternative is a relocation away from downtown in terms of long-term planning. Again, these are concepts, these are scenarios, these are not proposals at this time, just to be clear. And these are certainly, all of these are scenarios and concepts that will require much more engagement and much more conversations amongst the community, beyond the scope of this CRP planning process. So we're putting these here to start the conversation and set up some of the potential paths forward, but by no means are these strategies that we are recommending we start to implement today. And in fact, as you'll see in just a second, most of these cannot be implemented today under current law. So the long-term protection scenario one, which is providing a higher level of protection, really looks at sheltering the harbor even further through the development or the installation of a new barrier system that is meant to protect most of the downtown core. And if you are designing something like this, you're designing it to a very high level of protection. So in this case, we would be designing an elevated berm structure to a 2100 DFE, so a design flood elevation for a significant storm event expected in 2100. And if we're doing that, these are billion-dollar projects. We're gonna try to do as much as we can when we're designing something like this. So what we can think about is, how does this infrastructure not just provide flood protection, but really enhance the experience of downtown, adding new marinas, making sure that bicycle and pedestrian access is provided as part of the infrastructure, and really thinking about how this is not just hard infrastructure, but is also infrastructure that provides nature-based features, ecological services, and public access. Important to note that Steamboat Wharf continues to exist on the interior of this line of protection. And because of that and the general navigation needs of the harbor, we have a gate. So this is a gate that would be open under normal circumstances, but then would close in the event that a storm is predicted. And because it is open under normal circumstances, it does not protect against long-term sea level rise. So you still have to deal with the tidal flooding that can happen under sea level rise. And that's why we have the shoreline protection there that's already been built, ideally, and it is there to protect against that sort of chronic threat of sea level rise. So the barrier is there to protect against those low probability, but really high consequence or high impact flood events that can happen with hurricanes or nor'easters. So this is one potential alignment. We did explore a different sort of a separate strategy here that looks at a slightly different alignment, similar theme, similar overall strategy. Again, if we're building something of this scale and magnitude, we are thinking about this not just as flood protection, we're thinking about all the other co-benefits that it can provide in terms of ecological services, new marinas, boating access, pedestrian access. And I think the other kind of trade-off between this and the other one, the other alignment, alternative one, is that this would protect the creeks, the Marsh area, to the just to the south and east of downtown, from erosion, and potentially could help to mitigate some of the impacts of sea level rise on that marsh condition. So these are two alternatives for protecting to a higher level of providing a higher level of protection to downtown Nantucket in the future. We've moved offshore with these presentations because of the significant, I think, impact that installing this level of protection in downtown would have. The idea of installing a wall that is, twice the height of an average person along the downtown waterfront seems like a non-starter, seems very undesirable. And so installing, something offshore may be the path forward in terms of, if a higher level of protection is advanced for Nantucket, downtown Nantucket. Now, that's not to say that that's the only long-term adaptation pathway. There are different sort of routes we could take. And so this is a long-term adaptation scenario, the sort of living with water, if you will, approach, which looks at how we can use the new, the line of protection meant to protect against mean monthly high water, use that as really a retaining wall to establish a new grade for downtown. So this would be the sort of elevate in place scenario, where we look at adapting the grade of downtown to a higher elevation in the future. And in this case, both the critical infrastructure at Steamboat Wharf and Strait Wharf would also be elevated. But we would actually be looking at adapting each individual building either collectively or individually over time to a higher elevation and establishing a new grade for downtown. And this would, again, buildings would need to be designed to withstand the effects of long-term higher consequence, low probability flood events, but the downtown would be sort of elevated to account for a future tidal condition. And I think in this case, we can look at different scenarios for Brant Point, but as Brant Point, we're looking into the long-term future. We obviously have significant groundwater emergence issues and stormwater management issues. We want to maintain emergency access there as long as possible. And we may be able to adapt some buildings, but I think in this scenario, we also need to think hard about what relocating some buildings out of Brant Point might look like, and a kind of return to nature scenario for some areas of Brant Point where we would see, really intractable risks. And then the final scenario for downtown would be the relocate scenario. So this looks at an approach that actually contemplates relocating much of downtown out of its current location. This would be a path that would be taken if there's a decision that we're not going to protect. We're not going to stop water from coming in. We're not going to elevate the entire downtown. We're actually going to rethink really holistically, where our downtown is located. In this case, there are some strategic opportunities, though, to kind of maintain some of that character. What you see here, kind of the major move, or one of the major moves in this scenario, is the idea of elevating and relocating the existing wharves with historic structures on them. So we can kind of maintain some of the character and some of the identity of downtown by actually relocating some of the more significant historic structures and kind of the structures and areas that really define the character of Nantucket, and relocate those and kind of recreate them on new wharves that are tied into high ground and become the kind of new waterfront of Nantucket. This is obviously a very large proposition. All of these are very large propositions. They're not recommendations by any means, but they are kind of speculative scenarios that provide a potential set of paths forward in terms of adapting to long-term coastal risk for downtown Nantucket. And I just want to again be very clear that these are not something that we recommend implementing today. These require a lot more community conversation. I think happy to take feedback, but the most important thing I think is for the CRP to be able to recommend something that's implementable and starts us on a path towards resilience and risk reduction. And that's really the line of protection that we talked about at the outset. So with all that said, I will pause there and turn it back to Mary. I'm happy to return to other slides to look at anything in more detail here as we talk about this.
Thank you, Trevor. That's wow, a lot. I will note and appreciate that you caught out, not verbally, but on the slides, called out stormwater and drainage management. That is, of course, a key part of any of these projects. The water comes from more than one direction. So thank you for including that. And also mentioning the groundwater issues. We basically have water coming from all sides, left, right, and below. Thoughts from the committee members, comments? Gary?
So first, those are fantastic slides, Trevor. They are just wonderful to take a look at and think about the various scenarios. And one question I have is, do you think that with respect, when the final coastal resilience plan is completed, are we or you, someone going to be asked to make a recommendation as to which of those different plans we should proceed with or not? That was the first question I have for you. Second
Trevor, we're
question,
still seeing your screen, by the way. Sorry, Gary, go ahead.
yeah. Second question is a slightly different subject, and that relates to the study that Vince sent around that we haven't talked about, which was a very interesting to me and very kind of distressing to me as well. And that is the Fuss and O'Neill study, which talked about the Children's Beach Pump Station. And basically,
In the interest of time, I'm happy to come back to that. That is on the list for our new business to mention. So I don't want to get distracted into
Okay,
the other many reports that have come out recently.
okay. Well, then the first question is then, are you contemplating a recommendation as to which of those various scenarios that you showed to us we should select as our first priority?
Yeah, so I think we definitely want to make a recommendation for the near term next step. We want to be clear that this is what we believe the right, immediate next step for the town of Nantucket to make will be. I think in terms of the long-term scenarios, there's just so much uncertainty and so many more conversations that need to happen. I think we're very hesitant to come out with a hard and fast recommendation because, we've only, a year is a long time, but we've only been undertaking a planning process for a year, and we can't make decisions about this, sort of major either investments or kind of alterations to the livelihood of downtown Nantucket and those who cherish it very lightly. And so I'm hesitant, I think, to make a recommendation. The scenarios will be in the plan, and we can certainly lay up, what are kind of the considerations and topics for continued conversation attached to each. But I would be, happy to take feedback on this, but I wouldn't necessarily feel fully comfortable making a recommendation about that within the context of this CRP document.
Thank you, Trevor. Fritz, you had comment?
Two questions. One, on the short term, what's called short term, I think, for 2030, if you're going to be making recommendations, is there going to be estimated cost attached to that? And then I have one follow-up. Well, and then for the long term, my question would be, all of those long-term strategies, you mentioned at one point billions of dollars. The obvious question is going to be, where are the billions of dollars coming from?
Yeah, so the first question, the CRP will have cost estimates this is very early stage conceptual design, so cost estimates will need to be refined, of course, but we'll have cost estimates for those near-term actions, infrastructure actions in the CRP. And the long term, I mean, these are projects that are not going to be fundable on the town of Nantucket's budget alone, right? This is major infrastructure that may require federal, state partnership and investment. And I think I forgot to mention, neither of those alignments in the water could be permitted today. So we're talking about scenarios that require changes to regulations at the state and federal level. That's why we call them scenarios, not strategies, because they imagine a lot of different kind of blocks coming together to make them happen. Our thought, our thinking is that the risks are, I think maybe many people saw the recent study that came out I think yesterday, talking about just how significant and how urgent action on climate change is, because we're reaching a tipping point, right? And so that tipping point is going to mean that there's potentially going to be a lot of changes that will happen in the decades ahead that we can't necessarily know what they're going to be, but we can start to contemplate what the future may look like under those conditions. So. And again, I think that's back to Gary's point, that's why we would be hesitant to make a recommendation, because there's too much uncertainty to really be able to say anything reliably.
Thank you, Trevor. And Sarah?
Hi, thank you, Mary. Thanks, Trevor. I think that seeing these, as Gary said, this is really great to see. And I think for the long-term solution or scenarios, I think it's actually really great for us to use as an educational tool, because these are the scenarios, right? Like, these are the different possibilities. I wish Matt Fee was here because he wanted the wall. So, but I think that this is what we can show to people too, to say, we need these short-term solutions. and we need, and like, don't the short-term solutions seem reasonable now, because this is like what's coming down the pipeline. So I appreciate that they're, yes, they're still scenarios, but they're more concrete than these, like, you know, amorphous things we talk about. So I appreciate that. My question, however, is more on the short term when we're kind of like moving forward with these different options. I have two questions. One is, so the three alternatives that you showed were at different locations for specific to the Strait Wharf area. And is there a reason that we couldn't do multiple of them? You know, I mean, obviously cost, but, you know, like the kind of one further back that's town land that seemed to be more feasible. And then, you know, other scenarios like further down that would be protecting different infrastructure things. So that's one question. And then my second question is related to when kind of looking out for like the map when it was further back when we saw Brant Point and Washington Street. Outside that line of defense, there's a lot of infrastructure, homes, buildings, and things like that. What do we tell people, or what is the plan or the recommendations for that? Because that's the short term, right? So like in the next 10 years, we're not going to do anything for you. And I just wanted to like think if within the plan, is there language or is there a recommendation for those people, for those homeowners and businesses and things that are right outside the line of defense? Like, you know, obviously the line of defense is made for a certain reason, feasibility, raising the road, that kind of thing. So I just wanted to, you know, because we're beholden to the entire island and people in the community, I just want to have that discussion too.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, should I respond, Mary?
Yes, please go ahead, Trevor.
I think the second point, Sarah, I think the response, and I think it's something that extends not just to Brant Point, but to properties, you know, residences and businesses around all of Nantucket where we don't have a way to provide that district scale protection. We're not gonna build a wall around Mattocket as you'll see in a moment. You know, it really is about property owner action, right? It's about making sure that folks have the tools at their disposal to be able to reduce risk to their properties and make decisions that help increase their resilience. And that is something we'll talk about in a couple weeks, kind of the guidance that the CRP will include for building resilience at the property scale. I think a major theme, and this extends to Brant Point, is really under the town's control. There's a public interest in emergency access, right? There's a public interest in maintaining access to private residences, and that's what has been suggested for Brant Point. It's not necessarily providing defense against flooding, but it is ensuring that there is, you know, a resilient transportation corridor for those property owners, so that if they're able to retrofit their own properties, you know, they will still have that kind of connectivity to the island overall. And that's a theme that we'll talk about in Mattocket as well. And then I think on the multiple lines of protection, I mean, in some places I've seen, you know, kind of a planning process that leads to kind of two options. One is the public right of way, you know, the sort of like easiest path to implementation option, that the town says we can build this. You know, we know we have the ability to do this on our public roadway. However, there is this other option that could provide a lot more benefits and could be, you know, to in everybody's best interest, but we can't do it alone. So almost sort of exerting leverage to say, you know, there is another option here. There is a solution that may be more optimal, but it's harder to implement. And so we need private property owner participation and buy-in to be able to make this happen. And if we can't get that, then we have this fallback option. So that's an option we could discuss as kind of how the CRP wants to message, you know, a solution like that.
Great, thank you, Trevor. Jen, you have a comment, and I do want to make sure we have time for Trevor to continue.
Thank you, Mary. Just really, really quick, Trevor, it's actually kind of fun to see what these potential future options are. I think this is what we've kind of been thinking towards what could we really do in the future. On the short-term option, I had two questions. Short-term option, the question is, you showed, as Sarah was saying, just in specific spots, but I'm assuming for that protection to be effective for the whole downtown, it would have to be the whole downtown area that was done. Like we couldn't just do Straight Wharf, or we couldn't just do Easy Street. We wouldn't get the protection that we're looking for. And then the other question I guess I have is then on those long-term scenarios, so we can look at them and have a discussion. And I think we would have to have a discussion with all of, Nantucket to, what direction do we go with that? Is there going to be something that indicates a timeline, as in we actually have to make a decision about whether or not we're implementing something like this and when that would be, so that we know we're building up to like a 20-year discussion about how we're protecting the harbor?
Yeah, I think the implementation planning, all of this, once we have sort of as resolved as we're going to get through the CRP about what recommendations we want to put forward, then we'll have like a master prioritization and implementation kind of roadmap that would set out, this is when, honestly, the conversation should begin today, because we know that the risk is going to increase. These are concepts that need to start, we're starting this conversation today, I guess is what I would say. But in terms of like sort of more earnest planning, we can sort of say, this is the point in time where under current projections, it really makes sense to start to dial into what the long-term planning scenario will be. And then, yes, I would just to highlight Jen's initial point, which I think was something that I did not mention, but is critical, is yes, you do need to do all of that to have an effective solution. So it's not that you just build, a line of defense on Straight Wharf and then, you're not going to get the benefit unless you do kind of all of it.
Thanks, Trey. We also have a question or comment from Joanna Roach. So Joanna, go ahead.
So I have a question about, it's really a two-part question. One of which is what is the plan to get this information to the stakeholders? Because as I'm listening here, especially in terms of property owners who may need to be brought up to speed on that any of this is being considered, to people in sort of the town, like the Capcom committee, or folks who will make decisions around reorganizing capital projects based on this information, right? So, the town has $250 million of capital projects in the line, right? And so how do these projects move to the front of the line, or how do they get consideration, or how does the Capcom begin to understand that these things need to be taken into consideration simultaneously to the many other projects they consider?
Vince, do you have an answer for that?
A partial answer, not a complete answer. So in terms of getting them into Capcom or anything similar, we first of all have to have plan complete, and we're going to follow a similar pattern to what was done for the HMP. So we're kind of getting to see ideas now, but they're not complete. Once they are complete, we can start putting them on for various spending years into the future, the same way the HMP has done, so that it's not all going to be in the 2023 spending line. It's going to be spread over many years. In fact, I would think more like many decades, potentially. Then in the second part of the question is kind of harder. How do we get this to the public? First of all, CRAC is an open public meeting. That's one part. Second, how do we approach private property owners once these ideas are finalized? That is a far harder thing to do. And that is very much a boots on the ground thing. And I imagine part of it will be for me to start approaching people and have other town staff doing similar. But it has to be finalized first. I would think it's far from finalized.
Yeah, and I would just add to that this is a planning process and very conceptual design. There are additional steps of refinement and feasibility testing and 30% and then final design that will have to happen. Each of those steps can and should involve stakeholder participation, and that is something that the conversation around stakeholder engagement and participation in these designs and these solutions does not end with the CRP. In fact, it really only just begins. So it's not that the door shuts with the plan.
Can I interject briefly? Can I get yes or no from committee members to going past noon, because we are going to be short on time. I'm hoping that people are able to stay and continue to participate, but we do need to maintain a quorum to do that.
Okay.
I'm not seeing any particular reaction. How about a show of hands for yes, you can stay?
It depends how far past noon. I can say a little bit past noon, but not much.
Same for me.
I agree with Sarah, maybe 15, 20 minutes past noon, but not.
Great, thank you. I wanted to take a temperature check there. So Trevor, let's go ahead with the next part of your presentation. And if there are questions at the end that harken back to earlier parts, that's fine too.
Great. I'm going to, for this next part, I'm going to turn it over to Devin. And then just before I do that, I do want to also just acknowledge, our partners at STOS, and I think somebody from One Architecture may be on the line as well, who are helping with a lot of our visualizations and strategy development. So anytime you see something, I just want to make sure that it's clear that this is a team effort that we're working on. So with that, Devin, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Trevor. We can just jump right to the next slide. So in Mattakit, we're going to be talking about kind of the whole area more generally, and then we'll zoom in a little bit to a focus area along Mattakit Road, because we know that's been identified as a priority. But one thing I do want to say just from the start is that the Mattakit projects are going to look a little bit different, because by their nature, they are more of an adapt into possibly long-term retreat strategy. And so it's not something like downtown where we know, kind of exactly what a wall could or should look like. And so you'll see once we show these images that maybe they're a little, not more uncertain, but just shown differently. So to kind of summarize what we're thinking in Mattakit, this is an adapt strategy that really prioritizes extending the useful life of critical infrastructure in the area and maintaining emergency access to private properties, but also to the water access points that are located along Mattakit Road. Through that, we're also hoping to enhance the marsh habitats in this area and apply nature-based erosion management techniques to slow the risks of damage due to flooding and erosion in the area. As we mentioned with downtown, a huge component of this strategy is going to be private property owners implementing building scale kind of adaptation measures in order to address risks to major storms kind of today and in the future. So if we jump to the next slide, this is the near-term strategy. So, things that we should be implementing, talking about today and implementing soon for Mattakit on a whole. Some of the highlights, I think, that are worth calling out here are these two dune building projects. So you'll see one kind of off to the left here, and then one along the bottom, which offers protection to the roadway along Ames Avenue and Mattakit Road, kind of the little elbow in the corner here. And these dune building projects serve several purposes. First and foremost, it's a easy way to, not easy, but it's a way to kind of test what works and see kind of how things can evolve over time. And so these projects could be kind of installed now and then monitored over time to see what is most effective, what is most efficient. And you'll see that in the long-term strategy, we could possibly extend this kind of dune building project to kind of run along the entirety of the shore over time if it's proven to be effective. But since we don't have a sediment management study, we're not entirely sure what's going to work in this place. And so this is kind of a good way to jump in and test that. You can also see that the elevation of the Ames Bridge is something that we would recommend, that we have here for a shorter term recommendation. Obviously, that's still something that's been discussed in a lot of different forums beyond the coastal resilience planning process. And so we would want to be considerate of those other discussions as well. But elevating this bridge is kind of a critical, critical access to a lot of the properties that are in this area here. So With that, we also think that we should be talking about strategic relocation of a lot of these purple properties. So all the purple properties that you see are kind of located within the extreme risk tier. And so those are places that are vulnerable today and will become, increasingly vulnerable as time progresses. And so in the near term, we think it's imperative that we start talking to these property owners about their options and possibly co-developing a retreat plan. Adaptation of the public dock, kind of up here on the right side of the slide, is also something that we would like to maintain in the near term. That would allow access to continue, especially since a lot of these roadways and things are not at risk kind of immediately. And so we would be able to maintain access to that in the near term. And of course, going along with all of this, we would want to start restoring the salt marsh kind of on the back end of some of these properties to continue offering protection to those homes that you see in the yellow, and doing the same with the eelgrass areas. Though a lot of what we're proposing here would offer some will offer protection in the long term, it's not going to solve the flooding and erosion problem. So in addition to all of the things that are kind of shown on this slide, we would need to really start with the building level adaptation for anyone who's located in a high risk tier and might be vulnerable to erosion or flooding by 2070s. So if we jump to the next slide, Trevor, this is just another view of the same project area, maybe a slightly different perspective, but as I mentioned earlier, one of the key near-term steps for this project is an awareness campaign for the property owners in the extreme risk tier. And I think this is something that you'll see applies kind of across the island, not just in Mattakit, but we need to start talking to people about why their property's at risk, what that risk is, and possibly start working with them to develop some sort of relocation strategy and make sure they know what their options are. And I think that's something that really needs to be developed collaboratively in order for it to be effective. As we talked about, all of the ADAPT strategies kind of combine a series of different tools to slow the impacts of flooding and erosion, but it's not going to stop it. And so building scale adaptation is really critical to the success of any of these efforts. And I think, like I said on the earlier slide, these dune building pilot projects can definitely be expanded over time if we find them to be effective, and if what we're doing works, then we might as well expand them. So if we flip to the next slide, this is just a section view of what some of the things we talked about could look like, kind of similar to what we did in the downtown area. But a couple of things that we wanted to note about this strategy kind of moving forward is that although the pilot projects have a lot of benefits, we're going to need private property owner coordination and support in order to get them going. These pilot projects will also need to be permitted and reviewed by the Conservation Commission once they've been designed. But I think all of that effort is well worthwhile because they will offer opportunities to test different ideas and strategies to build our knowledge of the system and what works well to protect it, and evaluate the effectiveness before we expand it to cover the entirety of the shoreline. The dunes can also help to protect the Ames Avenue Bridge kind of in the near term as we're planning for any possible elevation. And so that's another added benefit. I think something else we've seen with dune building programs is that they're really a great way to get the public engaged and out there planting grass and doing something physical in their community. But that additional touch point would make it kind of, it'll help you start that conversation with property owners in this area about the risks that exist. And as we mentioned, the building scale adaptations are absolutely necessary. We aren't going to be able to protect everything forever in the Mattakit area. I think we can jump to the next slide, which will show kind of our long-term strategy. And a lot of the things that are shown here are just building on what we mentioned earlier. So you'll see kind of like this cross-hatched tannish color that we're hoping kind of relays the fact that the shoreline in this area is projected to kind of migrate and move what is inland now. And so there's a good possibility that in the long term, both the coastline is going to be migrating, but our dune building projects could also be migrating inland with that. And that also obviously assumes that many of the structures that were highlighted in purple on the previous slides, are now have been relocated, and these areas can be turned kind of into their more natural state over time. In the long term, we would also start thinking about possibly the strategic relocation of some of these properties that are in the high risk tier. So those are shown in purple here. And I think worth noting is that, in this long-term strategy, it's really likely that the Ames Bridge is no longer, we can't protect it in the long term, and starting to think about alternative ways to preserve access if we need to, possibly relocating the public dock to offer a different alternative. And obviously we'll have kind of migration of this marsh habitat, especially as we have all of these homes kind of relocated and allowing this area to return to nature. And I think that's all I had to say broadly. We'll jump now to Mattakit Road. And in Mattakit Road, you can jump to the next slide. I think everybody knows what we're talking about or the area we're interested in. So we've kind of chosen this area for initial elevation because we know that it is at risk and already experiencing some flooding issues, but it's also a piece of the roadway that is critical to maintaining access to the communities that we were looking at earlier. And so what we're proposing here is an elevation of the roadway to the 2070 mean monthly high water. This is very similar to what we discussed in downtown, where we're trying to find kind of the optimal design elevation for this roadway that's going to provide some amount of protection while also not having a whole lot of negative side effects, if you will. And so we think the 2070 mean monthly high water is great because it's going to kind of elevate the road so that it's not flooded several times a month or twice a week in the future, but it's also not going to cause too much disruption in the area, and it won't cause the roadway to have any impacts on private property. So this is kind of that easiest to implement for the town because it's not going to have too many serious effects on private properties nearby. With that though, in this area, we're going to have some building level adaptation of structures as well. And so those are shown in the yellow here. You'll note that the Department of Public Works is obviously one of those places. And in the near term, that could be things like making sure, anything that's absolutely critical is elevated, any generators or things like that. I'm not sure exactly what has been done on the site to date, but there are smaller things we can do in the near term to kind of limit the damages. Forgot to mention that when we're raising this roadway, we would also be expanding the existing culverts so that we can increase flow kind of between this area and the ponds kind of to either side. And we'll see that will have could have some negative effects. And so that's something to consider. I think this area is also a good place for a pilot study to start considering pond hydrology and salinity and just how expanding these existing culverts is impacting the natural area. And that's obviously something that, we could use to learn and kind of transfer those lessons to other areas. Can jump to the next slide. So another slightly different view of the same area. But for Mattakit Road, the key kind of next step is going to be raising the roadway and expanding those culverts both to maintain access and to increase flow between the pond. This mock-up you can see here, I don't think it was shown in the earlier version, but there's a potential to add an adapted docking area kind of alongside the roadway to increase public access to these ponds. And so this could serve kind of like a public amenity as well. We'd like to continue having an awareness campaign for property owners in the extreme risk area, which you can see kind of off in the distance of this image, and start collaboratively developing some kind of relocation strategy, and then making sure that we are applying the building scale adaptation for properties within the high risk tier, which would include the Department of Public Works. Some roadside plantings that are, I think, shown here, and marsh restoration could also be applied in this area to help reduce any flooding at places like DPW and any properties that are kind of along this pond area. I think one of the considerations we also want to talk about with expanding the culverts is that when you expand the culvert, it obviously increases flow, and that could cause flooding in other areas. And so really having a good understanding of where that increased flooding could happen would be essential for a project like this. So if we flip to the next slide, I think this probably has a lot of the key considerations I just said on the last one. Sorry about that. But obviously, elevating the roadway, expanding the culvert, and the wetland restoration strategies would require coordinating with private property owners like the Linda Loring Foundation and the Conservation Foundation. We know that the project is going to need to be reviewed and permitted by the Conservation Commission based on some kind of final design. And as I mentioned before, the increased culvert capacity can increase flooding in different areas. And so we need to be aware of where that flood increase could be and the possibility that, relocation might be needed in order to mitigate it. So you can see here, the roadway here is just raised, and I'm not sure how big it is on your screen, but you can see the kind of hydrologic connection between the ponds is shown kind of in between the raised roadway. And there's kind of an offshoot off to the left there of some kind of public access kind of along the road so that people can enjoy these ponds in the natural area around Mattakit Road. And I think if we jump to the next slide, we have the long-term strategy. So in the long term, we would expect and encourage the marsh to continue migrating in these areas where the culvert is. It might even we might even have maybe increased flow through the existing culverts in the long term to accommodate any longer term flooding, because the roadway has kind of already been raised to the 2070 protection. There wouldn't be a need for any additional raising of the roadway. If we raise Mattakit Road, we want to make sure that it's adequate so that we're not going to have to do it again anytime soon. One thing that we do see in this image is possibly creating a berm along the roadway to add some additional protection over time. And so that would be kind of like an additional step to add protection when flooding does become more severe in the long term. And that kind of same vegetated berm idea could be applied to the area in front of the Department of Public Works to make sure that it is protected in the long term. And that might even be paired with something that is a little bit more structural, kind of depending on the extent of flooding at this time period. Again, you can see the need for strategic relocation becomes more apparent in this area in the long term. And so though we don't need to start the conversation in this area right now, it's something to keep in mind that it might be needed kind of down the line for this area. I think that's all I wanted to say with the long term. Trevor, unless you had something to add.
No, I think that kind of covered the primary strategies for Mattakit. So let's, in the interest of time, turn it back to Mary for discussion.
Thank you, Trevor and Devin. Questions or comments from the committee? And if we want to save them for the end, that's fine too. Fritz, go ahead.
I was just looking at the extent of the quote strategic relocation, and it's mind-boggling. I mean, I don't know where we would relocate them to. I don't know how many people would really relocate. So it seems to me in many cases, we're going to talk about, it's just going to be loss of structure. But it really is mind-boggling, especially for Mattakit when you see it in the long term. And Well, I just have, I won't go into that, but anyway, in terms of the future, I think it makes us think a little bit about the magnitude of the change and what this plan. And ultimately, are we going to have a lot of people saying, we can't do that, we can't afford that? So anyway, that's just a comment.
Thank you, Fritz. Peter?
Yeah, I wanted to echo what Doug Rose said about getting our message right and getting that together as soon as we possibly can, and taking that one step forward. You know, it's another 3 weeks or so till we slow down a little bit. And a lot of the area association presidents with the Civic League are here. I know I've said this before and it's kind of gets shot down, but you know, if we could get them at one of our meetings and start to talk to them about it, because what Fritz just said is what those area association presidents are going to be talking about once the plan is released and we have our, whatever our recommendations are. And we'll get a lot of feedback. Maybe some of it's not so great about what these recommendations are. I just think that the area association presidents that are in areas that are vulnerable are going to need to be up to speed so that they can answer those questions. So maybe they should be at our meetings.
Peter, let me jump in on that. I will do my best to convey that invitation to them, but I think we might also look for taking it to them rather than inviting them to come see us.
Definitely.
We might offer to do a special session for them because it's an excellent way to reach a large number of people. And I think you have a very good point about those presidents representing people and being able to carry the message for us. Thank you.
Plus, you know, once, I know we don't want to jump the gun until the plan is set. We don't want anything out there until we know what it is and what our recommendation, until it's been released. But then as we go into the winter, maybe we do those meetings, special meetings for each one of those associations. Yeah.
And Vince had a comment on that as well.
No, not on what
sorry.
Peter was saying, but I'm happy to talk about getting association presidents or even the Civic League in general to attend. That'd be terrific. No, my question was more for Devin and Trevor. So you showed what might be needed for the 2070 storm line. So is that the end goal, or is that the last step in many steps along the way to get sea level rise resilience that keeps pace with resilience that keeps pace with sea level rise? Is this going to be incremental, or is this going to be a one and done?
Vince, are you talking about the proposal to raise Matticat Road in those
Correct.
locations? Yeah, so a road may have a design life, a typical road might have a design life of 20 to 30 years, right? But if we're designing a road that is meant to be, resilient, right? We're going to design it in a way that is elevated to the risk that it's likely to encounter over its design life. So if we're implementing something by 2030, I think we want to be looking at a long-term risk horizon that is out to 2070. So in this case, I think we don't necessarily want to have like an incremental design for 10 years track and then go back and rebuild in 10 years. You want to be looking at the design life of that infrastructure and what risk it's going to encounter. And so as Devin raised, the sort of optimal sweet spot, so to speak, is that sort of 2070 mean monthly high water where you're getting that risk reduction, you're providing long-term resilient access, and you're doing it in a way that really has minimal impacts on, what that road looks like and how it functions. So it's going to be, you're gonna get a lot of bang for your buck, so to speak, in terms of buying down risk, maintaining access to a portion of Matticat that really doesn't have any other redundant access, and you're going to be doing it in a way that buys you a lot of time. That doesn't mean that the process stops there. You need to continue to evaluate risk. There is longer term horizons that will need to be looked at in the future. So it's a little bit different, I think, than the scenario for like a downtown where we do something that's incremental today and then we continue to evaluate and there are next steps. This is more like we take an initial step now and then we build around that in the future. Does
For
that answer the
instance-
question?
Yeah, I
Oh,
was going to
sorry,
say,
go
for
ahead, Devin.
instance, building around it could include adding a berm at the roadway if necessary, if we see that, the road is not protected in the way we would like it to be. So it wouldn't be such an extensive, elevation type project. That would be really intensive and difficult.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that going up several feet is in one area, in one massive increment, to be resilient for 40-ish years for the sake of argument, could represent quite a substantial change that people would be it'd be jarring, to be frank. It could be difficult for people to accept, and because there's, sorry, the ecologist in me can't help it, going up such a high amount in such a short space of time could represent a barrier for the free movement of plants and animals, and basically things crossing the road that are other wildlife. So just have to bear that in mind as well.
I would offer from personal experience, Matticat Road has had elevation changes before. And I would think that it's probably our best opportunity on the island to accommodate a raise in elevation of a couple of feet with minimal impact on daily life, especially for the protection that you're getting. So that's my 2 cents on the issue, but I'm not considering ecological impacts at all. That's not my area. So thank you, Vince, for representing them. Trevor, let's go on with the presentation. We're at 10 minutes or 9 minutes.
Sure. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, and as I'm pulling up the slides again here, I just note that, we are going to be meeting with representatives from Linda Loring Foundation, and we've already sort of begun conversations and had conversations with folks over at Nantucket Conservation Foundation as members of this committee will know. And I think, the goal, again, the goal is not hard solutions here, raising a road for the sake of raising a road. The idea is that we're going to look, through the design process, we'd want to look for those opportunities to increase hydrologic connection and provide ecological services through the design as well. And you'll see that echoed a lot in this set of slides for Nantucket Harbor. So I'm going to focus on 3 areas: the area around Folger's Marsh, the area adjacent to Sacajah Pond, and then Co2. And I'll try to move quickly. I think a lot of the same themes that Devin introduced for Matticat hold true in this area as well. We have similar types of conditions where it's very much an adapt strategy. We're not going to be able to develop an infrastructure solution to reduce the risk. We need to begin to develop kind of more surgical type approaches that help us, increase resilience through things like maintaining access, building scale measures, and measures to slow the impacts of erosion. So we're going to focus first on Folger's Marsh. I know there's been a lot of discussion about Folger's Marsh and this culvert in the past that Nantucket Conservation Foundation, DPW, adjacent private property owners have all been engaged in. We want to build on that momentum and put forth some proposals for what we think would make sense here from a kind of engineering and concept design perspective. So this is the near-term strategy. Building off of some of what I understand conversations have been about elevating this culvert and converting it to more of a bridge structure. We would agree with that and would suggest that, if we're going to be making changes to Pulpus Road in this location, that we do go ahead and elevate this to an elevation that takes into account long-term risk. And so this is an area that's actually one of 2 areas of Pulpus Road that is vulnerable to kind of tidal flooding or significant kind of risk in the near term. And so this is an area where intervention is needed in order to maintain emergency access to this part of the island. And if we're going to make a major investment in a new bridge here, bridges have a design life of 50+ years. We want to be accounting for that long-term risk out to 2070. So would recommend a DFE, a design flood elevation that is tied to that 2070 1% flood event. And as we're doing that too, we want to be thinking about, there's an existing bike and pedestrian path adjacent to Pulpus Road here, but we also want to be thinking about, can we look for new opportunities to integrate additional public access? So this strategy does look at inclusion of a new Marsh walkway for public access, tying into existing roadway and pedestrian access points. And then of course, we would recommend, as anywhere, building level adaptation in the high risk, not the extreme risk, but both the extreme risk and the high risk tier. The goal of the sort of raised roadway and bridge structure is to both elevate it above flood elevations, but also to increase the hydrologic connection between Folger's Marsh and the upland wetland area. Right now, I believe it is a culvert structure that does impede that flow. So we kind of have a win-win here in terms of ecological value and resilience value to the human population. I think part of the strategy here too is intended to keep in mind the connection between Folger's Marsh and the harbor overall. And as we'll see in a minute, we'll talk about Code 2 and the connection between Code 2 and what happens here. But the eelgrass habitat and ensuring conservation and restoration of eelgrass in Nantucket Harbor is a key part of the strategy for this area. And this is a section diagram similar to what we talked about for Matticat Road, looking at what that elevation looks like. You can see that as we, this elevation could be quite a bit higher than what is currently contemplated or what is currently existing. And so that will be, I think we talked about the impact of Matticat Road raising. I think here we may see more substantial visual impacts, but in our preliminary thinking, that these are warranted given the benefits of the community. And I think through a design process, a bridge or a causeway structure here could be designed in a way that is appealing and kind of fits with the character of Nantucket while maintaining emergency access. Some of the considerations are obviously that adjacent private property owners need to be heavily engaged in any investments or proposals that happen on their property. Conservation Commission, as with all strategies involving wetland resource areas, need to be a pivotal part of the conversation and will ultimately have to permit the project. And then just an additional note about the increasing hydrologic flow, beneficial to plants and animals and fish, but can increase flooding on the upland side of the structure. And so we need to account for that in terms of any structures that might be at risk due to that increased flooding. And then the long-term strategy really just builds on the near term. We've already kind of elevated the road to a higher elevation to account for long-term risk. We should continue to monitor that risk and ensure that our elevation is appropriate, so that if future adaptation needs to happen, it can happen. The other strategy here that's sort of long-term adaptability is thinking about, we can increase to a certain degree of hydrologic connection today, but building in the potential for longer term additional connection over time, so that as we encounter greater levels of sea level rise, we're able to open up additional connections over time between the upland and the tidal marsh area. Moving right along to Sacajah Pond. Similar strategy here, where we know that this is a portion of Pulpus Road that serves Sconset and areas of the island on the south and east shore, and is at risk today, and in fact has been subject of some interventions to reduce that risk. We'd like to propose kind of a better, more sensitive set of strategies here that maintain access along this portion of Pulpus Road, but also do so in a way that has a number of co-benefits and really builds off of existing proposals. So in this case, we are looking at Again, elevation of the road to the 2071% annual chance flood design flood elevation. We think that's prudent because one, this is a significant capital project, and also there is likely to be significant, with sea level rise, more instances of breaching at Sacajah Pond, and this road becomes subject to significant wave energy and wave risk. And so in those cases, we want to make sure the road is elevated to provide emergency access, but then also look at wave attenuation. We already know we have wave energy in the pond. That wave energy would increase under a significant coastal storm event. So we want to be thinking about how to mitigate that, but also thinking about how that mitigation can happen in concert with potential public access. So the key near-term step here is raising the roadway and bike path to maintain access, and at the same time increasing hydrologic connection between the pond and upland marsh areas. And we are proposing the idea of a elevated marsh walkway that would incorporate access into the sort of Sacajah Pond side of Pulpus Road. And that would incorporate or be connected to wave attenuation structures that will help protect the roadway, but also create habitat for plants and animals and fish. And then of course, any structures across the island, but in this case too, would require building level adaptation for mitigating coastal flood risk. This is a section of what that might look like. Some of the considerations attached to this strategy are that private property owners, particularly in this case, Mass Audubon Society, would need to be heavily engaged in any kind of design process. They own the land that is adjacent to Pulpus Road in this area. Obviously, they have goals around the protection of habitat. And I think we would be open to and interested in continuing conversations about a design process that could help enable risk reduction through wave attenuation, but also public access into that area. Conservation Commission, another stakeholder that would need to be engaged. We think, anytime that we think about public access, this is an opportunity not just for recreation, but for community education and capacity building. So as we're thinking about, what a wave attenuation structure might look like, is there an opportunity to build kind of community awareness about what resilience means, what these structures are there for, why they look the way they do, as well as the kind of habitat or ecological services and ecological benefits that they provide. And then the longer term is, again, building on the short term. We want to make sure that what we've designed to is already taking into account that long-term risk, but that long-term risk is going to increase with potential breaching of the shoreline adjacent to Sacajah Pond. So as we are understanding how that risk may increase in the future, there may be additional wave attenuation strategies that would need to be implemented. We may want to look at additional hydrologic connection between Sacajah Pond and the upland. And then finally, for buildings that are in today's high risk tier that may eventually move into that extreme risk tier in the future, we would want to look at strategic relocation. Again, these are the longer term strategies, not necessarily today's strategies. And then lastly, I will talk about Code 2. So Code 2 is just a really critical resource for Nantucket for all the reasons that you are familiar with. In the near term, the strategy is really about making sure that we are enhancing the what is essentially a barrier island system ability to keep up with sea level rise and erosion. So we would recommend beach building and other nature-based solutions, and we would recommend prioritizing Code 2 among many other areas of the island for those interventions. If we are thinking about a limited number of resources, we really want to be working closely with the trustees, with Nantucket Conservation Foundation and other property owners to ensure that we're adopting strategies that build this beach, help gain elevation where it's most needed, and ensure that Code 2 is able to kind of keep up with the impacts of sea level rise. The reason we think that this is a priority is because Code 2 protects the harbor, right? And breaching, we don't understand what the consequences of a breach of Code 2 would be, but our sense is that it would be significant and disruptive to not just ecological communities, but also to downtown Nantucket, to human communities as well. And so couple of other additional strategies that we recommend is, of course, the island-wide sediment transport study. I think we really need to make sure we have a sediment transport study at a minimum that looks at this area of Nantucket. And we need an ongoing erosion monitoring program to really understand how sea level rise is impacting Code 2. And then finally, a modeling study is recommended to really understand the consequences of breaching. So I think there's been a lot of discussion about what would happen if Code 2 breached. How much sediment would move through? Would it greatly increase risk to downtown or other areas of Nantucket? Those are questions that are good ones. We don't have an answer to it. We need a detailed model to really understand what that looks like. And so we would recommend a follow-on study that really does try to drill into that question and put data behind answers to potential breaching scenarios. And I won't belabor this. I think I touched on most of the points here, but the key near-term step is maintaining the beach through nature-based erosion management, dune plantings, dune building, and beach nourishment. The goal is protecting the harbor and the eelgrass, as well as the communities that live along the harbor. And we need to establish a really robust ongoing monitoring program. I know NCF has been doing a lot of work on this front. I think there's a great potential partnership opportunities there to really study Code 2's response to sea level rise. And then again, that modeling study to really build data that helps us make a case for what the appropriate long-term responses should be. And yeah, again, I think I mentioned most of this, but stakeholders like NCF and Conservation Commission need to be engaged throughout this process. I think near-term nourishment, we want to make sure that any nourishment that is proposed is going towards the areas that need it most, so it should be prioritized to the lowest elevations. I know NCF is currently undertaking a study looking at some of these areas, and that'll be a great resource towards helping prioritize that work. And then in the long term, kind of building off what we learned through additional monitoring study and kind of our interventions in the near term, there are things that may be necessary. So there is the potential offshore structures that if we learn that the consequences of a breach would be very significant, for example, if we see that despite all of our best efforts through nature-based, fully nature-based solutions, that Code 2 really is not responding well to sea level rise. There are solutions that can be studied and implemented, such as offshore breakwaters, both emergent and submerged, meaning ones you can see above water versus ones that exist below water, as well as groins. These are structures that the need, location, orientation would all warrant further study or need further study to understand. But the goal would be to implement structures that help the accretion process, help Code 2 keep up with sea level rise by kind of enhancing the natural processes. And so that is what additional study and analysis and monitoring would help us understand. And I think ongoing conversations with NCF and other stakeholders need to start to think about as long-term potential strategies or scenarios. And with that, I will end. I'm just going to put this slide up for a second. I'll put it up again in a moment too, just for any members of the public or other members of CRAC who have seen this presentation or want to provide feedback prior to 2 weeks from today. We do have the address nantucket.crp@arcadis.com, where we're happy to take feedback and comments on the strategies here. The other thing we're interested in hearing about is visualization. These are draft visuals that we're looking at, but we are working towards the final CRP here, and we want to make sure that the way we're communicating some of these strategies is clear and helpful to the community.
All right,
So,
thank you, Trevor.
thank you.
We do not have time for comments at this moment, so please do use the email address to send them. Peter has had to leave the meeting, so thank you, Peter, for staying. I'm going to try and make this as quick as possible. How many of our committee members are available next Tuesday at 10 a.m. for a meeting for our regular business, which would not feature Arcadis as a speaker? Can I get a quick show of hands? So it's me, Peter, Gary, Sarah, Jen. Thank you so much. We will schedule that meeting to deal with regular business. I appreciate you all staying late, and Trevor and Devin and Chelsea for appearing here today with a presentation. Lots to think about. I'll take a motion to adjourn. Okay, if you all want to stay and talk, that's fine. Thank you, Gary. Fritz, I'll take that as a second. Roll call vote. Gary Beller.
Aye.
Sarah Boyce.
Aye.
Peter Brace has left. Jen Carberg.
Aye.
Fritz McClure.
Aye.
Joanna Roach.
Aye.
And Mary Longacre, aye. Thank you. We'll see you in a week.